Hey everybody, it's Mike. It's Monday, September 27, 2021, and just before 9 a.m. here on the East Coast in sunny Raleigh, North Carolina. We've had some fabulous, fantastic weather over the last couple of days, and today is going to be no exception. So, this morning what I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the content in the updated version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears. This is the version of the book that was released this past September 9th. All of the content in the book is also in the box set, the hardcover version that was scheduled to be available on October 12th of this year, but because of the current situation in the world and supply chains being interrupted, the availability of the box set is now TBD, to be determined. So what Tom did was to put all of the updates into a refreshed version of the paperback. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, 180 footnotes. I think the last time I talked about the book, I was about halfway through. Now I've finished the book as far as reading all of the footnotes, and I'm going to talk about some of the highlights. All right? Now, before I do that, I also want to say that at the end of this video, I would like to take you through another possible ghostwriter for Billy, and that would be Eric Stewart from 10cc fame. And then I'll also take a look at Emmett Rhodes, Alan Parsons, and studio guitarist Big Jim Sullivan. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from an outline I put together so that I don't miss any of the key points. And let me put my readers on before we get started here. I also want to say that my notes are my interpretation of what I read in the footnotes. Okay, so anyway, I want to go back first to an email exchange before the book was released where Tom said that some will find the information in the updated version to be disturbing. And he is correct. The book does indeed contain disturbing and dark content. This edition takes a deeper dive into who Billy is and who he thinks he is. And I have to tell you, it does get a little weird. The elites have a fanaticism with Egyptian gods, and they are immersed in Egyptian mythology, as well as being totally invested in Crowley's religion of Thelema, which also links back to Egypt. Memoirs tells us if all goes according to plan, Alistair will be venerated as a prophet for predicting the Aeon of Horus. For those that want to learn more about the Aeon of Horus, I will leave a link below to a Michael Tessarian article where he discusses the topic. The article is 28 pages long. The book tells us the philosophy and ideology of Paulism is pervasive throughout the world and is the gateway to the one world religion. The controllers or cultic elite see Paul as a graven Christ figure and savior. This religion will be based on the principles of Crowley's religion of Thelema, and as I've discussed in previous videos and presentations, the Beatles set the stage to dismantle Christianity. Now remember, in Memoirs it tells us that the Illuminati declared war on Christianity back in 1962. The first public pronouncement emerged when Lennon stated that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. Later on, John stated by 2012, Paul will be Jesus, and in his song, I Found Out, he sings, I've seen religions from Jesus to Paul. I would also like to point out that Paulism appears to be a play on Pauline Christianity, which is also referred to as Paulism, and is the theology and form of Christianity which developed from beliefs and doctrines espoused by the Apostle Paul through the New Testament writings traditionally attributed to him. So what they did is they overlaid their church, which I believe is the religion of Thelema, over the existing church of Christianity. So it's a form of mockery. It's the same thing the Roman Church did when it went out to conquer paganism in order to replace it with Catholicism. Now here's where it gets very strange. There's a belief by the controllers that a transmigration took place, and Billy possesses not only the essence or presence of biological Paul, but also of Egyptian deities, specifically Osiris and Horus, making Billy a Osiris-Horus-Christ figure. In other words, he is godlike. Something that the book tells us John Lennon rejected. And that was the reason for the insert that John included with his Imagine album where he's holding a pig. And a pig is considered vile in Jewish mysticism. So there's the Kabbalah tie-in. While the ram is considered a holy creature. And of course, this was Lennon's response to Billy's Ram album, where we have the symbolism of Billy holding the ram by the horns, which was more Egyptian Osiris/Horus symbolism. So it was Lennon rejecting Billy as this godlike figure. And then the footnotes get into Billy's trauma-based programming, which is disturbing in itself. We are told it started when he was 3 years old, when he was identified as a child prodigy. He was tutored by Crowley for 10 years. So Billy was born in 1937. Crowley died in 1947. So there's the 10 years. And it's my personal opinion from reading all of this that it's likely that Billy's programming continues at least to some degree through today. And the programming was done to keep him focused on music and to instill in him that failure is not an option. So as I was reading the footnotes, I was thinking that this belief of him possessing the energy or essence of Osiris/Horus was part of the mind control program to convince him that he is a god or that he is godlike. And this premise that Billy considers himself a god first came to mind when I saw the notation in the 9 after 909 edition of Memoirs where certain passages, important passages in the book, were denoted with a pyramid with an eye. The eye of Ra, the eye of Horus, the all-seeing eye inside that pyramid. And that eye, of course, is McCartney's eye with the raised eyebrow. And I was thinking to myself, why is the book using that notation? And then I started thinking, maybe he thinks that he's a god. And then this update comes out of Memoirs. And it's confirming that in his mind, at least that's my interpretation of this, that that's what he believes. That's what he's being told. Then there's a footnote that tells us that Billy practices sex magic, and sex magic works best when you're performing solo, meaning masturbation. And he did engage in sex magic with Linda and with groups. Now remember that story going back to 2018 that had this headline? Paul McCartney said he and John Lennon masturbated together with friends. Well, that was revelation of the method. I remember when I first read that article, I thought to myself, this is so debased. It's so depraved. Why is he talking about this? And at the time, it didn't dawn on me that it was sex magic. And now we can see that that was exactly what was being communicated out. So he was telling us in that article that they, meaning he and John and others, were engaged in sex magic. So anybody who still believes that the Beatles were not immersed in the occult, and apparently here, at least Billy and John were engaged in occult practices, this is just another validation of what I've been trying to communicate out with my research and with my presentations. The book also tells us that babies conceived from sex magic are slotted for important positions on the world stage. Okay, so there you go. So when people wonder, how do certain people get to certain positions of power and influence? They are the result of sex magic. And the implication is that there is something very special about them because they were conceived through an occult ritual. Okay, so there is also a footnote that tells us that biological Paul was, quote, slain at 5 a.m. on September 11th, 1966. So the story about Paul storming out of the studio, which led to the car crash, might mean that the car crash narrative is not how he died. And again, I'm reading between the lines here. maybe what happened is along the lines of the Walrus documentary, and I'll put that link down below if I can find the documentary on YouTube, where Paul was just sacrificed. He was murdered. So you would be hard-pressed to try to figure out why it is that he was driving his car around 5 a.m. in the morning. I mean, it could happen. But it's starting to make more sense that he was just taken out. And the recent video I did where I discussed the memoirs clue about British MI5 agent Maxwell Knight appears to play into this as well. And let me just make this point. Whenever I talked about the car crash, I always positioned it as the prevailing theory on how he died. I intentionally stayed away from a definitive position because there is no way of actually knowing. And the reason why I mention this is because there are people out there that intentionally take my words and twist them and misconstrue them in order to stroke their own dogmatic agendas. Okay, so I just want to make that point. So with this footnote that talks about being slain at 5 a.m., and then the whole bit about, or the clue about Maxwell Knight, it certainly appears that there's another twist in the plot as to how Paul may have died. And so as I was reading through all this, as unbelievable as some of this seems, and I admit, I mean, it's very weird, it's very strange, and it's very dark, it would be easy to chalk it up as nonsense. But the problem is we see the Egyptian and Crowley symbolism everywhere. It's pervasive. And I've discussed this in presentations and have shown many examples of how the truth is hidden in plain sight. We exist and interact in an occulted realm. And it's so far beyond the comprehension of the general masses that it's impossible for most people to wrap their heads around it. The fact is, the people and beings running the world are hardcore occultists. And as disturbing as the book is in certain places, and it is, it's also very revealing. But I will also say that the book is not for everybody. I have to admit that when I got to the footnote on page 557, I became very angry as I read about the controller's plan for massive depopulation as part of the, quote, New Age. It is a very troubling footnote, and I have discussed this with some of my colleagues that also have the updated book, and we all feel the same way. In fact, we had to take a couple of days out to just pause, reflect, and regroup mentally about some of the stuff that was in the book, especially the stuff that's talked about in the footnote on page 557. So what I'm going to do, or what I'm planning to do, I should say, is that I'm going to reconvene the ladies for a round table, and I'm going to ask Ofer, and Ofer, if you're listening to this, and I'm sure you probably are, this is the formal invite to join us for that round table. And what we would like to do is to talk about the new information in the book, a lot of what we're talking about here, and to get the perspectives of my fellow researchers and colleagues on what this all means. But the bottom line is, Memoirs discusses and digs deeper into how immersed the controllers are in occultism, mysticism, and the esoteric. And I do see a contradiction between what Billy believes he represents and what the controllers are doing. And it's also interesting to me that Billy is who he is because the people in power, the pyramid of power, the cultic elite, have placed him to be where he is. And in fact, had to go through trauma-based mind control, handling, grooming, and all of that stuff. And that doesn't sound very godlike to me. And it also says to me that if he went through this process to be where he is today, then it's probably a good bet that every one of them that are in positions within the pyramid, within the high-level ranks of Masonry, within the ranks of the Illuminati, and the book tells us there are 13 degrees within the Illuminati structure. 66 in total. 33, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Above that, 13 degrees of the Illuminati. And then above the Illuminati are 20 degrees of people and beings who are truly in the shadows. Okay, so there you go. There's the eyebrow-raising aspects of the book. Elsewhere, Memoirs continues to dismantle the Beatles' Cinderella narrative, straight up telling us the band was never organic and that they were a creation of Tavistock. The book does not mince words on that piece of the story. The book also continues to validate my research and conclusion that the Beatles did not write all their own music, and tells us the Wrecking Crew model was used throughout pop music in the 1960s and 70s, and the Beatles were no exception. There is also a footnote that mentions Glenn Campbell, who played with the Wrecking Crew and was a phenomenal guitarist, and I'm thinking what we are being told is Glenn possibly played on Beatle recordings. As many of you know, I believe guitar virtuoso Vic Flick played on many of the Beatles recorded tracks, and another person who was a major studio musician back in the day was Big Jim Sullivan, who was also an accomplished sitar player. And I think it's possible, in fact I think it's likely, that Big Jim played the sitar on Norwegian Wood as well as guitar in that song and other recorded Beatle tracks. And then the book tells us on page 477, the footnote on page 477, that instrumental supplementation was required when the band did not have time to learn how to play the new songs. And those who follow my channel know that this is something I have discussed a number of times. In fact, let me take a moment and read the footnote on page 477. Break it out here. All right, so it says, the Our World broadcast, this is the broadcast where they sang All You Need Is Love, was not the first Beatles performance while singing and playing along with an instrumental recording. Most concerts were noisy enough that the fans could not hear the band fumbling. Interesting choice of words. However, for quieter audiences, instrumental supplementation was required when the band did not have the time to learn how to play the new songs. This is what I've been saying all along. For example, fans have pointed out that in the video of the July 1st, 1966 afternoon show at Budokan, while George is singing If I Needed Someone, he waves at someone without interrupting the sound of his guitar. And of course, the clips I showed was not of If I Needed Someone. I'll have to take a look at that. But I showed how they missed their cue at the beginning of the song Day Tripper, where neither George nor John played the riff, and also the shenanigans where they kept turning their back every time the riff to Paperback Writer was being played. So I called into question whether they were actually playing or were they miming the parts. And so I found that footnote to be very, very interesting. So before we look at Eric Stewart, Alan Parsons, Emmett Rhodes, and Big Jim Sullivan, I wanted to share with you that Tom told me that they are, and the they, meaning Billy and everybody involved in this disclosure, are looking to further speed up disclosure in 2022, so next year. And one of the ways to do this might be to have memoirs published through a major publishing company. Okay, so I believe his runway is very, very short, and that the date that we are given in memoirs of February 2023, something's going to happen on that day. Again, I don't know if he's going to pass or he's just going to retire, and that's going to be that. But clearly they're trying to get this out as quickly as they possibly can, so they're really putting the pedal to the metal now. Now, after I do the roundtable, I plan on taking time off from the Beatles topic. I have personal commitments that I need to attend to, as well as focusing more of my time on getting people to wake up to the current worldwide situation, which in my opinion is dire and needs a lot of attention and needs as many of us to try to shake the trees and get people to open their eyes. Because what's going on right now, I believe, is tied back to that footnote I talked about on page, 557 in Memoirs about the depopulation. I think it's all tied together. Okay, so with that, let me switch screens and we'll take a look at Eric Stewart and the others that I spoke about. So stick with me. I'll be right back. Okay, so a little bird whispered in my ear and said that we should look at Eric Stewart as a possible ghostwriter for Billy. So let's read the opening paragraph here from Wikipedia on Eric. Eric Michael Stewart, born January 20th, 1945, is an English singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and record producer, best known as a founding member of the rock groups The Mindbenders, with whom he played from 1963 to 1968, and likewise of 10cc from 1972 to 1995. Stewart co-owned Strawberry Studios in Stockport, England from 1968 to the early 1980s, where he recorded albums with 10cc and artists including Neil Sedaka and Paul McCartney. Stewart collaborated with McCartney extensively in the 1980s, playing on or co-writing songs for McCartney's solo albums Tug of War, 1982, Pipes of Peace, 1983, Give My Regards to Broad Street, 1984, and Press to Play from 1986. Since 1980, Stewart has released 4 solo studio albums. So when I spoke to this person about the fact that Wikipedia admits that he collaborated extensively with Billy and that he was co-writing songs, they said to me, well, it was more than co-writing, that he actually was ghostwriting. Okay, so another possibility. Now let's take a look at Big Jim Sullivan. So James George Tompkins, born February 14th, 1941, and then Big Jim died on October 2nd, 2012, was known professionally as Big Jim Sullivan. He was an English musician whose career started in 1958. He was best known as a session guitarist. In the 1960s and 1970s, he was one of the most in-demand studio musicians in the UK and performed on around 750 charting singles over his career, including 54 UK #1 hits. Okay, so that's quite a resume. But let's take a look at the sitar. In the 1960s, Sullivan learned to play the sitar, having been inspired by attending a recording session for Indian classical musician Vilayat Khan. God, I hope I pronounced that right. Sullivan released an album of Indian-style recordings under his own name, Sitar Beat, in 1967, and one as, quote, Lord Sitar on the album Lord Sitar from 1968. He played sitar on a musical interpretation of the Kama Sutra. Sullivan was among a group of English guitarists who adopted the sitar, including George Harrison of the Beatles, whose Esher home Sullivan regularly visited to practice on the instrument. Now, I don't think Big Jim was there to practice. I think Big Jim was there to teach George the sitar. Throughout this period, Sullivan studied formally with Nazir Jarazavoy, and until 1969, he all but abandoned guitar in favor of the sitar. Together with Harrison, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, and Sean Phillips, he was among the most dedicated of the many rock guitarists who embraced the instrument during the 1960s. Now, I don't know about you, but considering he released 2 sitar albums in 1967 and 1968, I think he was very adept at playing the sitar, and I do believe he is who we are hearing on Norwegian Wood. Okay, so just my take on things. All right, let's talk a little bit now about Alan Parsons, because the Alan Parsons project is very interesting and has ties back to the Beatles. So if we take a look at the image on the right here, we again see the one-eyed symbolism with the shadowing effect. This is the same thing we see on the Beatles' second album with the Beatles. It's one-eye symbolism. And if we read the first paragraph, it says the Alan Parsons Project was a British rock band active between 1975 and 1990, whose core membership consisted of Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson. Parsons was an audio engineer and producer by profession, but also a musician and a composer, whereas Wolfson was a songwriter and composer by profession, as well as being a pianist and a singer. Almost all songs on the project's albums are credited to Wolfson Parsons. The Alan Parsons Project released 11 studio albums in its 15-year career. So there we have the number 11, and of course 1 plus 5 equals 6, including the successful I, Robot and Eye in the Sky. Nice titles. So if we page down to Formation and Debut from 1974 through 1976, this gets even more interesting. Alan Parsons met Eric Wolfson in the canteen of Abbey Road Studios in the summer of 1974. Parsons acted as assistant engineer on the Beatles albums Abbey Road and Let It Be. He engineered Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon and produced several acts for EMI Records. Wolfson, a songwriter and composer, was working as a session pianist while composing material for a concept album based on the work of Edgar Allan Poe. So, and the article goes on, and I will leave a link down below. So, it's very possible, I think, that Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson could have been ghostwriting on behalf of Billy and maybe backing up into the Beatles, maybe the later period between 1967 and 1970. Maybe. Okay, so just some more dots to connect. All right, so let's move over now to Emmett Rhodes, and Emmett has always been high on my list as a possible ghostwriter for Billy, maybe even the Beatles, but I think more so with Billy, especially during the Wings period, along with Greg Masters. And if you've ever listened to Emmett's music, you will hear some very, very McCartney-esque melodies. The production is very Wings sounding, and Emmett was known as the one-man Beatles. And he started as a drummer by trade, and then he took up the guitar. But he was a very, very talented guy. He's no longer with us anymore. He died last year, July 19th. He was born February 25th, 1950. And so, let's just read this a little bit. So Emmett was an American singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and recording engineer. At 14 years old, Rhodes began his career in musical ensembles The Palace Guard as the group's drummer before joining the Merry-Go-Round as a multi-instrumentalist. He recorded his 3 albums from 1970 to 1973 and was called the One-Man Beatles for his musical inspiration. His career ended in 1973 because of a trial with his label. Silent for 43 years, he was a cult figure of psychedelic pop music when he released his last album, Rainbow Ends, in 2016. So I think it's possible that Emmett didn't really retire. I think it's possible that he went on to ghostwrite, and in particular, he was ghostwriting for Billy on behalf of Wings. So I'm going to leave a link to Emmett's music down below. You take a listen and let me know if he doesn't sound a lot like Billy during that whole Wings period. Okay, so just some tidbits there, my friends. And so with that, I will conclude this video. The comment section is open. Everyone have a great day, and we will talk soon. Thank you very much for taking a listen.
They burned their records and spit on their images. But before they burned the records, they had to buy them.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did. I was just saying it as a fact. I was using expressions on things that I just read.
The Passover plot speculates that the Bible is a hoax and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Jesus survived, and in order to create a new religion with himself as the Messiah, he made people believe that he'd risen from the dead.
He said to me once that the children of 2000 will be listening to the Beatles.
By 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.